Watching a loved one slowly lose their memory, become highly agitated, even combative, it's tough to watch and really it's tough to handle.
It is, and the Alzheimer's Association has some great resources to help you navigate that challenging time.
And this is Chick2Chick. You know, it's no secret. We're getting older. Our parents are getting older. And I think everyone is really, really concerned about what's going on with the aging brain and the deterioration of cognitive skills. You know, my mother is 87 years old, and knock on wood, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but this is functioning just fine. But I do worry about that because I went through this with a very good friend of mine. Her mom, she was spunky, she was spry, she was spirited, and then just watching her deteriorate, she would lose her memory. And then she would get so angry and so agitated. And I think really she was probably frustrated that it was coming across in this aggravation, this agitation. It was tough for me to watch. I just can't even imagine how that felt for my friend.
Right. And while you had that experience, you know, my grandfather, I mean, he really went sideways. And it was so terrible to watch. My stepfather. So here's just you and me with these examples. This is why we have a really important guest today to talk with us about it. Clay Jacobs is the executive director for the Alzheimer's Association Greater Pennsylvania chapter. Clay, we're so happy that you are here today to shed some light on things. But first, let's kick it off with talking to us about what the Alzheimer's Association does.
Absolutely. And it is a privilege to be here with you today. And I think the topic you're bringing up is so important for so many Americans. And I have the privilege of working for the Alzheimer's Association because we're the leading voluntary health association around Alzheimer's disease and all other dementias. And so we think of it, there are certainly the broad base, but our goal is our vision is a world with all Alzheimer's disease and all other dementia. But that means that we have to work towards research, work towards activating individuals and communities, provide resources and support. So we know that this is a disease that impacts people so individually and community. And across the U.S., the association wants to be there to be able to support them through that journey.
So in my case, I have an elderly mom, as I had mentioned. She seems to have this all up here. I mean, maybe it's too much. She remembers everything.
Yes, she does. I'm going to be the good daughter. Everything. Yes, she does.
But what should I be paying attention to? What should I be looking for if there is an onset of dementia or Alzheimer's with her?
When we see personality or judgment changes, when we see difficulty performing familiar tasks, right? Somebody who used to bake and knew the recipes by heart, but is really struggling to put those things together. When we see issues with understanding time and place. And so there's a whole slew of things on warning signs that should prompt maybe a conversation with family or a conversation with the doctor. But they're all things that continue to get worse and are different than the normal.
And is it hereditary? I've heard people say, oh, you know, well, the grandmother had it. I'm worried I'll have it. And if that's the case, is there anything that can be done to sort of stave it off, you know, keep it at bay for a while?
It is. And so one of the things we've learned is that Alzheimer's disease in particular is not necessarily directly linked to genetics. There's certainly risk factors, but there are a whole slew of other risk factors. And in fact, just last month, the Lancet Commission, which looks at research across the world, found that, you know, up to 45% of cases of dementia could be potentially prevented. And the things they looked at are really in a couple big categories. We talk about social activity, so engaging and connecting with others in the way that fits us, mental activity, things like diet and exercise. So a lot of those things that we think are good for our heart and brain really are true. And as research looks, it's making sure it's true for everyone. So there's quite a bit of research going on. But we know generally right now there are things you can do to give yourself the best chance and to try and keep your brain as healthy as possible.
Well, you said that R word. What are the risk factors?
Yeah, and there are quite a few. As you talk about unmanaged high blood pressure or diabetes, we look at history of head injury. We look at a whole slew of things there that are the opposite, right? So heart health is an important one. And so as we look at some of those things, they are ones we can manage. Now, the challenge on some of this is that the research has been in smaller communities or smaller groups. So what may be effective in a certain kind of population may not be true for everybody, but we're learning so much more. Family is a risk factor, and there are certainly certain genetic things that put you at risk. So we see them through genetic testing and others, but they don't guarantee you'll get the disease. And so the biggest risk factors we know right now, are things like high blood pressure, obesity, managing diabetes, all of those other health issues. And really part of what we think comes from that is just they're all things about keeping our brain as healthy as possible so it has a chance to fight against whatever disease, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia.
What resources do you provide to help us navigate that difficult time as well?
Yeah, I think that's so important. And often, we're in an area where treatment's available for the first time, and we're talking about things like biomarkers to diagnose the disease earlier. But families and families of choice who are surrounding those living with the disease are such an important part of this. And so there are a few things. When you look at the Alzheimer's Association, and we were founded by caregivers. And so things like our 24/7 helpline, support groups, education programs, care planning sessions, all of which are available in person, online, or via phone. When you look at some of the other supportive services on, particularly if you, as I mentioned, care planning or care navigation, connecting with others early in the stages, all of those things are services we provide. But then also we work with places like health systems. So, for example, across the country right now, something called the GUIDE model is in place for the first time ever. And Medicare and Medicaid are looking at what is it like if we provide full dementia care navigation. So if somebody comes in with a concern, they don't leave with an 800 number, but they get access to social workers and nurses and a plan for the future, access to 24/7 support, medication management, all of those things. And so it's not only how do we provide support today, but we're finally seeing the support we see for other tragic diseases catch up in this space. And so that folks don't have to say, I wish I knew about the Alzheimer's Association when, but really they get the resources right when they need them.
And support is so important when you're dealing really with any type of a disease or illness. This might sound like a crazy question. You talked about some of the other risk factors before, and Carrie and I are really, really conscientious about food and what we eat. And there's been this whole movement to go, clean eating and using food as medicine. Is there any link to the food we eat sparking dementia or Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so it again goes to risk. And so I think one of the really interesting things we see is a lot of those studies and research looked at things like the MIND diet or the DASH diet, which certainly showed to have benefit. The piece that we often didn't see in that early research is how do you replicate it in different markets, right? So the Mediterranean diet is really important, but access to some of the things there isn't necessarily the case everywhere across the world. And so, in fact, right now in the U.S., there's something called the U.S. Pointer Study. And it has sites in North Carolina and California and Chicago and other places that say, okay, based on your diets and other pieces, what are the foods and other things you could be integrating that we know actually can in real world situations impact your risk and keep your brain and your heart healthy. And so I think that's the exciting thing is, right, one of the studies that predated it was the Finnish geriatric study, and it was all folks from Finland, but their diets were very similar. You start looking at some place like the U.S. and what are those diet pieces that really make a difference? Those are the results we're finding out now. And pretty consistently, we're seeing that there is an impact. Yeah. Again, it's about risk, but it certainly is something, if we can manage our risk, any one of us would do so to be able to avoid this dreaded disease.
Yeah, the other thing the two of us are really big on, and that's exercise. And one of the things that I read actually recently is the concept of walking and talking.
Which I have mastered.
It's not just for us.
I have mastered that.
And I think, there's some people who think, how can that possibly have anything to do with, your brain health? But if you do have someone who does have the capacity to get out and move, and why is it important to have both those functionalities at the same time for the brain, to be healthier and firing quicker?
Yeah. Well, and we talked earlier, right? Social activity and physical activity. And that's a marriage of those both, right? So it's one of those things that increases blood flow to our brain, increases our general health. forms new synaptic connections. And so it's this, we hear of terms like the pieces around learning things as you get older, right? It's harder to learn a language, but it sticks with us, right? Those conversations, those synaptic connections is really this idea of neuroplasticity, that our brain grows, it gets stronger, it builds those connections. And so the more we have, the greater capacity we have. Even if Alzheimer's disease steps in, you have more synaptic connections. And so that idea of pairing social activity and physical activity, doing those things in, because it's not doing a crossword every day. Because, right, just like if you think of the drive you take home, so you barely have to think about it after you've done it enough times. And so those aren't new synaptic connections, but doing these things and connecting with other people certainly is something that helps drive that and keeps our brain healthier.
Clay, this question is twofold. What tips do you have for the caregiver who is dealing with somebody who is losing their memory or becoming highly combative or agitated? What tips do you have for them to deal with somebody who's going through that? And then on the other side, what tips do you have for the caregiver? Because this is tough to handle day in and day out. And I'm a big advocate that, I think that caregiver needs to take a break sometimes and not feel bad about it. Yeah. So can you answer both of those questions?
Yeah, and it's such an important perspective. And I think both come down to people, right? And so when we talk about how do we interact, how do we improve interactions, all of those types of things, it starts early. It's knowing the person. It's person-centered care. So what do they like to be called? What are the things they enjoy? What are the things that help them connect? How do we reminisce about positive times? How do we know the things that may trigger behavioral changes or other components? And so it's really helping build that plan, because in this disease, we don't see the brain changing. We see the person changing, but it is changing. And so that means the thing that works today likely won't work 6 months from now or 9 months from now. And so that idea of being intentional about it, but that goes to the caregiver support, knowing where you can turn for resources, knowing when you could take a pause, knowing just that you're not alone. So often we see spouses and partners who see these changes and their friends or family show up less, they're less comfortable going out. And so it becomes this incredibly isolating disease for a disease that impacts 6 million Americans. And so first on that planning and knowing the resources, knowing what those things are, knowing that'll progress, but then the same on taking that pause and knowing the resource for caregivers. I think both are equally important, and knowing when to call on them, right, when you have access to. That's the one thing, is there are supports out there, but too often we do the best we can, and that is without knowing all the things that we possibly potentially can.
Yeah, if people just reach out right away, they're going to be better off both for themselves and for their loved ones. So where can people find more information about the Alzheimer's Association?
Yeah, so the Alzheimer's Association, we have a 24/7 helpline available in 200 languages and dialects. It's master's level clinicians. It's available at 800-272-3900, no matter where you are. And then you can also visit places like alz.org, or in particular, when we talk about caregiving, alz.org/care has access to all of the resources, either virtually or right in your backyard, or some, if they're over the computer, right in your lap. So those two places, I think, are the great place to start, in addition to your local resources and physician and others.
Awesome. Clay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You really provided so much great information. Yeah. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. An absolute pleasure.
I think he said something so insightful there towards the end when he said, the person isn't changing, the brain is changing. And I think it's hard to remember that because this is like one of those invisible illnesses. You can't see that the brain is deteriorating, and you forget. And it's hard sometimes to deal with these folks, so we got to remember that.
Absolutely. Listen, we appreciate all of you tuning in today, and we hope that you enjoyed this podcast. Do us a favor, head over to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe till we're back to chirp about another topic.